Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is our first event in the spring semester in our ongoing year-long series, 20 Years After 9/11, Addressing an Enduring Legacy of Harm. Perhaps nowhere is that harm more consistent, more ongoing than the prison at Guantanamo Bay. The goal of our series is to both explore the ongoing abuses, human rights abuses that stemmed from 9/11, but more importantly, to bring together some of the brilliant thinkers and advocates who have been working towards solutions, to hear their views on how we can end this harm. Today's panel brings together a brilliant group of speakers, each with their own unique perspective on the harms of Guantanamo Bay. We have with us Alka Pradhan, Human Rights Counsel for Guantanamo detainee Ammar al Baluchi. She's also a CLS 07 graduate. Mansoor Adayfi is a writer, artist, activist, and a former Guantanamo detainee. Mansoor published a book last year based on his experiences at Guantanamo. It is called Don't Forget Us Here, and everyone should read that. Terry Rockefeller is a 9/11 family member and a founding member of the organization September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And finally, moderating today's discussion is Scott Reams, the Washington director of the Center for Victims of Torture. He himself has written and advocated on these issues for many years. Scott, we're eager to hear from everyone here today, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Priyanka. Thanks to the Human Rights Institute for holding, I think, this really important event, for all of you out there for joining, and especially to each of the three outstanding panelists we're going to hear from today. I want to provide just a little bit of background that I hope will be helpful to our discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Mansoor, Terry, and Alka. About a month ago, as I'm sure many of you saw, Guantanamo marked its 20th year. Just under 800 men and boys have been held there over the years, all Muslim. There are 39 men who are still captive at Guantanamo. 27 of them have never been charged with a crime. Like President Obama, President Biden has promised to close Guantanamo, but since taking office, he has transferred only one man out, the same number of men that President Trump transferred out. Now, according to US government's own documents, communications, things that former Bush administration officials have said, and perhaps not surprisingly, to those of you who know a bit about Guantanamo, the prison was established with purposes that included, and I would say these two are primary purposes, holding men outside the reach of the law and preserving as much secrecy as possible around torture that the CIA inflicted at its network of global black site prisons during the so-called rendition, detention, and interrogation program before sending those same men to Guantanamo. The war court system that President Bush established out of whole cloth at Guantanamo, called the Military Commissions, was intended similarly to allow for prosecuting these men, and in several cases seeking the death penalty against them, without the fact that the CIA tortured them, putting the government at any sort of litigation disadvantage. Of course, it would have in federal court. And again, to preserve as much secrecy as possible around US torture. You'll hear more about this from Alka and Terry in a few minutes, and in particular, how sort of this effort that the government claimed would bring swift justice, in particular for the 9/11 attacks, has for 2 decades essentially produced exactly the opposite for everyone involved. Now, most of the American public, I would submit, for them, Guantanamo is out of sight, out of mind. Again, one of the reasons that the government chose such an inaccessible place to set the prison up. And when Guantanamo is the subject of public discussion on those rare occasions, it's almost always as a policy issue. Right now, that's sort of true as far as it goes. It still costs $500 million a year to run the prison. It still opens the US up to charges of hypocrisy on the international stage. We saw that recently with both China and Russia. It does damage to national security, and both policies and politics, at least the perception of politics, have played a major role in obstructing closure to date. But all that said, I would submit that Guantanamo is not first and foremost a policy issue. It is first and foremost about human beings and the harm that it's caused them, something that we don't hear about a lot. This includes men who remain there today, such as a 73-year-old man who's had multiple heart attacks, a wheelchair-bound 60-year-old, several men who are suicidal, a host of men who are suffering the effects of torture and prolonged indefinite detention and can't get the medical care that they need, either because Guantanamo can't or won't provide it. It includes men who've been released from Guantanamo, but whose lives of their families, in some cases lives of entire communities, won't ever be the same. It includes family members of victims of attacks with which some of the men are accused, but have never received a public trial, most never a trial, much less a fair trial. And it includes, in a broader sense, communities of color inside and outside of the US, which our government continues to see through a security threat lens. And that mindset is one that Guantanamo, and the fact that it hasn't been closed now for 2 decades, I think reinforces more powerfully than anything else. So it's in that context, Guantanamo's human costs and how it's impacted and shaped individual people's lives, that I'm going to turn it over to our panelists for each of them to talk for 4 to 5 minutes or so about their own experiences. Then we'll share some thoughts about, as Priyanka said at the outset, how we might finally close Guantanamo, and then hopefully end with a robust Q&A with all of you. So with that, Mansoor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Scott. First, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I would like to welcome you all and welcome my hero and lawyer, Alka. Actually, those are the heroes who work in the shadow. Thank you so much, and thanks all to all of you and Guantanamo lawyers. Wow, it has been 20 years, and I mean, we're still talking about closing the detention, which shouldn't exist in the first place. As you know, 1 month ago, we have like the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo, 20 years of torture, 20 years of oppression, injustice, abuse of power, and indefinite detention. And always, like I said, death sentence for the people still there. 800 men, around 800 men imprisoned there. Only 39 still remain. 20 of them, like, now have been cleared. Some of them have been cleared in 2009 and 10, yet still there. In my experience, Guantanamo, it was created, as you know, it was established outside the law, outside the humanity, outside of the justice system. And this is the core of the problem, you know. By fighting for justice to Guantanamo, we're actually fighting for justice for the American justice system that has been misused and abused. And in my experience, I spent around like 15 years in my life at Guantanamo, didn't know why I was there and until when. And also the systematic torture and abuse that have been there that only, you know, broke us over and over again. I mean, we didn't understand what they wanted from us. And yet still, we still live, even after Guantanamo, we still live in the shadow of Guantanamo, stigma of Guantanamo. And being at Guantanamo, we went through stages of how Guantanamo was shaped from the very first days and how it became like turned to be experimenting lab, you know, experimenting, developing torture techniques, then to be just oblivious, you know. So far, if you are lucky, if you're like a citizen, if you are a citizen of Europeans or American citizen, you have more luck, because I remember we had one of the Saudis who had his American citizenship. He was immediately taken from Guantanamo to the United States. Other from England, from Germany, they spent like 2 years or 3 years, because again, it's the citizenship. So at Guantanamo, we were fighting for justice, protesting, asking for justice, asking to be include the same justice system they accuse us that we want to destroy, American justice system actually. And they are the one who actually abused that system, not us. When it comes to our release, I think it's a joke. My lawyer Alka will explain about this. When you go to the PRP process, it reminds me of the Hunger Game when the Katniss, she became like the Mockingjay, and she didn't want to play the capital puppet anymore. And her mentor told her, the only way to go out of it, you have to go through it. At Guantanamo, the only way to go out of Guantanamo, you have to go through their nonsense process. If you refuse, it means you're doomed to stay. For example, one of the cases last year, one of the brothers denied clearance because they said he didn't have plan for his future. The man spent around 20 years tortured, abused, indefinite detained, totally isolated from the world, and they didn't want to clear him because they accused him of he didn't have plan for the future. Imagine you're in Guantanamo, you spent entire adulthood being an old, and you didn't have any concept what the world looked like. And because you didn't tell them your plan for the future, which you didn't know you were going to send, you didn't know what to expect, you got to be cleared. So, I mean, this is one of the aspects of the craziness of Guantanamo. It's total chaos. Guantanamo, it's not about American safety or security. It's not about that. Guantanamo become an idea and become, that it becomes a symbol of injustice that encourage other countries to do so. And many countries fall apart now. Guantanamo is now everywhere. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, China. They have their own Guantanamos. And they justify their Guantanamos because of Guantanamo. They also blame Americans for Guantanamo. So Guantanamo also, from the American politician, it turned to be a political game between the Republicans and the Democrats. Republicans accuse Democrats being, if they want to close Guantanamo, something about it. Democrats are always afraid to do something or to transfer detainees, or because they will maybe lose some vote, or they don't want to jeopardize their whatever. So it's not about justice. It's not about the human being who, being detained indefinitely at Guantanamo. It tends to be a political game. And who pays, if you are being a detainee, you're just so unlucky. And, solving Guantanamo mystery, it is really easy. It's justice. And I think lawyers can explain more about this, just including the justice system solves that. So we spent 15 years, around like 15 years I spent there. And I was lucky when we moved to the common living. I managed to learn the language, start focusing on myself, although we were limited to everything we have there, either like resources, access to education, but the will and determination for us, because for me, I didn't want to leave that place as an empty shell, angry person, because that's what place do, turn you into something, you weren't. And the more you stay in prison or Guantanamo, the more you are distanced from your previous life. You start constructing a new life, and new memories, and new experience, and new emotions, and new relationship, and new knowledge, but everything related to your detention, everything. So in 2010, it was scary because when we arrived in Guantanamo, we had no shared life with each other. We didn't know each other. We did nothing about our captors. So everything was new, dark, scary. And we were just reacting to whatever they threw at us. I mean, we didn't have but we didn't know what to expect, how to react, how to deal with these people. And years and years and years, we went through hunger strike, hardship, until 2010 when Barack Obama was elected. We had hoped that he was called the detention, but it didn't happen. So what they did, they relaxed the camp rules. They are smart. They're very smart. They didn't change the rules, which was our demands for years and years. They should change the stop the torture, stop the interrogation, stop the mistreatment, and you know, give us communication with our families and so on. But at Guantanamo, we had no rights whatsoever. So what they did, they just relaxed the rules, and they all of a sudden everything had changed. Just in 1 month, everything had changed, and we moved from the communal from the solitary confinement. I was in force feeding for 3 years, to the communal living. Yeah, yesterday we were treated like the worst of the worst, killers, terrorists. You know, the way they treat us, they made you feel that you that dangerous person. 5 guards move you, pepper spray. You know, sometimes guards with earth team, they have to. Second day, 2 very nice guards laughing with you, talking to you, and only handcuffs. And what was like? I'll ask question. What was that about? So I went in the communal living. We spent almost like around like 8 years or 9 years in solitary confinement, on hunger strike, on force feeding, in fighting, and then we meet again in the communal living. The things we were talking about, the last 8 years of our life. We talk about the hunger strike, the torture, the interrogation, about our brothers who died, about the people who lived, about who stayed, about, you know, and it was shocking to me because we were given little freedom, but we were going deeper and deeper in our imprisonment. So we started reliving our past, because that's what we have together in common. This is what connects us, that we talk about it daily life, you know. we get TVs, we get PS3, we get satellite, we get newspaper, we get like calls with our families, books, classes, and making arts. And like, why would they treat us? Why we were asking what they would lose if they treat us that way? So they want to silence us, and we understood that. But at the same time, we were so tired, and our brothers said we cannot take it. We need to relax a little until to see what's going to happen. Maybe something will happen, keeping hope alive. But it was also we were going deeper and deeper in our imprisonment until 2013, when the army took over of the camp. They reset Guantanamo again. Again, we had to go. It was even worse than the first day, because the first day a little, you are fresh, but after 12 years, or yeah, after 11 years, you know, they reset Guantanamo. You are getting old, mentally and physically devastated, and you have to go from point zero. We had to go on hunger strike, force feeding, mistreatment, and so on and so on. I think Alka knows about the story. So it was like a vicious circle, and whatever you say, whatever you do, it will be used against you. I used to write letters to former Guantanamo detainees, you know, about their lives. Some of them end up in countries where they have difficulties, and sometimes give them some advice. Try, because that we used to that Guantanamo helping and supporting each other. Those letters were used against me in my PRP. He is contacting the former Guantanamo detainees. Even now, after Guantanamo, I'm not allowed. I cannot write letter to the brothers at Guantanamo. They told me if you write letter to be used against in their PRPs. So I'm writing to my iguanas and asking to convey my message to my brothers. Trust me, I have many letters to the iguanas. So we are fighting the idea of Guantanamo, you know, the stood for injustice, oppression, torture, and so on. So for me, as a former Guantanamo detainee, I think it's my duty to speak out about the Guantanamo, to bring the truth to the world. Especially, I wrote my book, Don't Forget Us Here. Intentionally, I wrote it for Western readers. Just, this is who we are at Guantanamo. And this is what happened there, you know, because still the government, you know, have a lot of secrecy around that place. And we were striving for justice, you know, simple as that. And even the basic of human rights don't apply at Guantanamo. And not just us, former Guantanamo detainees at Guantanamo were victims of Guantanamo. Also guards, camp staff, even the lawyers themselves. Trust me, those lawyers has to go a lot through hardship, searches, rules change over and over again. Not just the COM rules, military commission, the PRPs. The rules keep changing over and over again because it's there is no legal basis for that place, and the government cannot change anything at any time. I don't want to take more of your time, but I hope I managed to cover everything. But I hope that something positive, especially we really have good lawyers who are fighting for the men there, for the closure of Guantanamo and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mansoor, for sharing those experiences and reflections. Terry, could we turn it over to you?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. I just want to say what a real honor it is to be speaking alongside of Mansoor and Alka in the 20-year struggle to end the injustice that Guantanamo has been and continues to be. You don't always know who all your allies are, but as I've gotten to know Mansoor and read his book and learned about the courage he had in resisting and organizing within Guantanamo, I've been really awed. And as I have said at more than one closed Guantanamo rally, we really need to thank the defense attorneys like Alka, who have worked to ensure that there is some semblance of the rule of law at Guantanamo. I think, I'm going to very briefly focus really closely on the 9/11 military commission at Guantanamo. I am a 9/11 family member. My sister Laura was killed in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. But I also need to acknowledge the importance of my colleagues in September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, who over 20 years have really worked for what we thought we deserved, which was justice and accountability. So in May of 2012, 5 men who were accused of planning the 9/11 attacks were arraigned in the military commissions. When the prosecution met with 9/11 family members at that time, they told us it would be about a year before a trial would probably start. But almost 10 years later, we are still having pretrial hearings with virtually no end in sight. Both of my parents died without any justice or accountability for their daughter's death. And hundreds of other 9/11 family members have died waiting for truth and justice and accountability. And 20 years later, it really is time for a change. For those who don't attend the pretrial hearings, and as Scott pointed out, Guantanamo was pretty much designed to keep it out of the public's consciousness. It can be truly difficult to understand just how dysfunctional and broken the system is. Why this has happened, I'm going to try to be concise. The first reason is, I think, because all the 5 defendants, 9/11 defendants, before they were ever brought before the commissions, were tortured at CIA black sites. And while family members have been waiting for 20 years to hear evidence about how the attacks that killed our loved ones were coordinated and carried out, we have instead listened to hundreds of motions and years of argument concerning just what evidence can be admitted in the military commissions if there were a trial. These legal arguments are very complex and they involve classification and national security, but basically, in my non-lawyer opinion, they boil down to this. The government wants to use statements that the defendants made, but it wants to keep the evidence of their torture classified. And the defense attorneys want much greater disclosure of the details of the torture and the client's medical records. We see this as a set of legal arguments that could easily go on for years. And this has been made all the more likely by what has been a shocking turnover in personnel. One learned counsel has had to be replaced. More recently, the chief prosecutor and one of the lead civilian attorneys for the government retired. And most troubling has been the turnover in judges. As of today, there have been 4 presiding judges, actually 8 judges if you count those who only played administrative roles. 4 different judges before a trial even begins. And over the years, some judges have overturned their predecessors' decisions. But as really troubling and as disturbing as this should be to all Americans, not just 9/11 family members, I am hopeful because I really do believe this is a moment for profound change. We in Peaceful Tomorrows are firmly committed to pursuing pretrial agreements, which would essentially end the military commissions. And while we do not feel that this is the fair and open trial that family members deserved, we do think we would get answers to some of our questions. We understand that the details would be worked out by the defense attorneys and their clients, but we see that, or hope that in exchange for the government's giving up the death penalty, family members could expect some stipulation of facts about the defendant's acts. We hope that there could be a mechanism where we could ask questions of the defendants and somehow get answers to those questions about who did what, why, and how. These are answers we have been denied for decades. I want to stop there. I look forward to your questions and to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Terry. Last but certainly not least, Alka.
Absolutely the least. Thank you, Scott. And I just want to say, like, it's always a pleasure to speak at Columbia, my alma mater. Thank you for the invitation, but it is particularly daunting to speak alongside Terry, who I've known for some years now and who has been such an eloquent advocate on the issue of the military commissions and the problems with the military commissions. And particularly my friend, my dear friend, Mansoor Adayfi, who, you take a look at the wall behind him, that is, those Post-its are the projects that Mansoor is involved in, that he has worked on. And let me tell you something, Guantanamo was engineered to break people, right? That is the purpose of Guantanamo Bay, of the prison at Guantanamo Bay. And certainly you cannot be faulted for coming out of Guantanamo and suffering the effects of that torture, of that abuse. But I think, the fact that Mansoor is able to speak about his experiences and to tell his story is enormously instructive for the rest of us. And I just want to take a moment and recognize that because I cannot imagine being able to do what Mansoor is able to do. And I just want to plug his book really fast, which is amazing and everyone should read it. So from my perspective, I have worked for almost a decade at or adjacent to Guantanamo on both what we call the habeas side and the military commissions side. And on the habeas side is, of course, trying to get men like Mansoor cleared for release before the periodic review board, and then negotiate their releases. The habeas side includes challenging the conditions of confinement at Guantanamo, including, I know Mansoor mentioned the hunger strikes that have taken place at Guantanamo that still continue to take place at Guantanamo. And so, habeas litigation has included challenging abusive force-feeding techniques that amounted to torture, and working as much as possible in the shadows between the State Department, who are officially conducting, or who were at least officially conducting negotiations with potential resettlement countries, and the potential resettlement countries themselves, trying to convince those countries that the propaganda that the United States put out about the men at Guantanamo, particularly in the early days, to justify the creation of Guantanamo, actually wasn't true. And part of this sort of catch-22 that still persists to this day when we're looking for countries to resettle these men is that we have told so many untruths about these men. We have used false information in so many cases about them to justify holding solely Muslim men in an offshore prison, that it is now almost nearly impossible for the government to officially backtrack on that and say, actually, we made a mistake. We paid bounties for many of them, or, we were mistaken about their involvement with, bin Laden or Taliban, et cetera. It's just legally impossible for the government to do that. And so we're stuck in this catch-22 where we have to say, look, we don't believe that they're dangerous anymore. Right? The implication being that they were at one point dangerous, which for the vast majority of the 800 detainees, nearly 800 detainees held at Guantanamo, is just not true. Mansoor mentioned the PRB process, and I just want to say, quickly, it is, on one hand, the fact that men are cleared through the PRB process really says something, because you have to get 6 different government agencies to unanimously agree that the men no longer pose a threat to the US government, which just getting 6 government agencies to agree on anything is almost impossible. So that speaks to the quality of the information that the government had justifying their detention in the first place. But from the detainee side of it, what you have to do, and you're told this by the government, is that you have to show remorse. You have to show remorse for something you may have never done. You're told specifically, do not fight the allegations. Do not argue that you were not at Tora Bora, that you were actually sold for bounty, that you had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, which we could prove in several cases, right? But we were told, do not make those arguments because you will lose. You will not be cleared. Show remorse. That's the only way to get out. And I think Mansoor mentioned one of the men whose PRB was denied last year, and that was one of them was my former client. And I truly believe that the reason that his PRB was denied, that's Khalid Qasim, is because he did not show sufficient remorse for something that he is alleged to have done that he did not do. Mansoor is the best person to talk about post-release, but release is really just the beginning of the story. It's far from the end, and his book goes into this in some detail. It really is just the beginning, and we need to be looking harder at what happened to these men after their release, because I believe that we, the United States, have a continuing obligation, having detained these men and abused them and tortured them. We have a continuing obligation to ensure that they are in safe circumstances and that they are given the tools to prosper afterwards. And that has not been the case historically. So now, and I promise I won't speak for too much longer, but my work now is on the military commissions side of Guantanamo, and I represent a detainee named Ammar al Baluchi. Ammar is going to be 45 this year. He's been in US custody since April of 2003. And he is one of 5 co-defendants in the case of United States versus Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which we call the 9/11 case. And these are capital proceedings that are taking place, as Terry mentioned. They've been taking place for almost 10 years now. It'll be 10 years in April. They're taking place in an offshore courtroom that was created by a statute written specifically for application to a small group of Muslim men. This courtroom was created for men whom the US government admits having tortured. They admit having used some of them for human experiments, including Ammar. They admit to having broken them at CIA black sites. The government still hides information about their torture from Capitol Defense Counsel, including me, which is why the proceedings have taken so long. And I can't phrase it any better than the way Terry did. She mentioned the torture having affected the length of proceedings. What people need to understand, and this is a fact that I feel like that it is really not public enough, is that justice was not the priority when these men were picked up. The US government arrested these men who ended up being, are now before military commissions, and made a conscious decision to interrogate them in secret prisons abroad instead of bringing them to prosecute in a fair and open trial that Terry mentioned that the family members, of course, would have wanted. People don't realize that this was a conscious decision, because that decision is why the evidence is now tainted. That decision is why we had to construct the military commissions for this particular group of men, which is illegal under international law. So there are two very, very different sides of Guantanamo. But the common thread is torture. Torture and racism, because racism is the reason that Guantanamo has been allowed to endure for so long. The, sort of uneasy comfort, I think, that the American public has gotten used to with having these sort of, to the vast majority of the public, nameless, faceless, men of color, Muslim men, being held at Guantanamo Bay and being told over and over again that this is necessary for national security, when in fact, quite the opposite is true. So I will stop there. I have so much more to say about torture and how it endures at Guantanamo, but I'll save it for later.
Thanks so much, Alka. Yeah, I think each of the panelists today could probably hold their own half-day event, and it would be gripping and an important listen for everyone. Just so everybody is on the same page, and I saw this just pop up in the Q&A, when any of us are referring to either the periodic review boards or the PRBs, as Alka noted, that's an administrative process that the Obama administration set up to determine whether any person at Guantanamo, I believe the language is, still poses a continuing significant threat to the United States. And if the answer is no, that person we often refer to as quote unquote cleared for release or cleared for transfer. I think important to know about that, it has no legally binding effect whatsoever. It's not analyzing whether somebody was properly detained, and a decision either way has no legally binding effect. The president could transfer everybody out of Guantanamo tomorrow if he wanted to, notwithstanding whatever the periodic review board said. And then one other quick note I want to mention, because folks have started to discuss medical and mental health issues. Both Alka and Mansoor mentioned the periodic review board denial in Mr. Qasim's case. That denial, I think Alka's exactly right. It was about refusal to be remorseful, but it is also specifically by its text about behavior in detention and inability, this is not my terms, to regulate emotions. For someone who's been indefinitely detained for nearly 2 decades, the idea that that could be a premise for continued detention, I find extraordinary beyond what I can articulate coming from an organization that provides rehabilitation services to torture survivors. Alka, you should jump in on that for sure. And then just real quickly, maybe you can take now in reverse order, just a minute or two from each of you on what you think is the single most important step, fact, thing to consider for actually getting Guantanamo closed in 2022. Why don't you just take us off out of that?
Sure, and sorry, I do always jump in, but my only thought about Khalid's that inability to regulate emotion is I'm having a hard time regulating my emotion right now about this topic, right? And I'm just a lawyer, So when you talk about regulating emotions for men who have been physically and psychologically abused for decades, right? That's when you start to get into real Kafkaesque language coming from the United States government. Okay, and it's something that I'm deeply ashamed that the government is still engaging in and justifying in for administrations into Guantanamo. But I will leave it at that on poor Khalid. In terms of closure, I think I embrace what Terry said in terms of, from the military commissions angle. I do not personally believe that a fair trial is possible anymore and for 9/11. And I think that that is a really hard truth that needs to be said. Not just because the government's primary evidence, I think we've shown adequately and are continuing to show in the 9/11 proceedings is derived from torture, but because the men themselves are deeply damaged from what happened to them. And the ongoing, what I call ongoing torture, is legally and medically ongoing torture at Guantanamo, which includes conditions of confinement that are meant to duplicate their conditions at the black sites, and this sort of withholding of medical care, Scott, that you mentioned, right, for their torture. The only way, people can ever recover to any extent from torture is through really rigorous, holistic physical and psychological care. And that is not only is that not provided at Guantanamo, it's not possible at Guantanamo, but it is actively withheld from these men, right? So, it is just not possible to have a fair trial. I don't believe, even if you were to move it somewhere else, I don't believe it's possible. So then you need to start looking at case resolution. And, the White House, the NSC, the Department of Justice, they all know where to find us. They all know how to contact us. I'm right here. I'm on Twitter, you need to start talking to the attorneys and having serious conversations about next steps on that. From the habeas side, it is much simpler, and that should have started. I'm shocked, frankly, that it didn't start on January 21st of last year, that they didn't start clearing these men and transferring them, getting them ready for transfer, because I know firsthand that those negotiations take a really, really long time because of everything that you have to put in place, both security arrangements and just convincing countries to take them because of the existing propaganda. So it needs to start happening fast.
Thanks, Alka. Terry, your thoughts?
Yes. I want to stress how much the 20th anniversary has kind of changed the community of 9/11 family members. And I'm not talking, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows has been, working for pretrial agreements, actively discussing it since 2016. But I think that there is a realization that is dawning on people that the trial isn't, if they're following the trial at all, that the pretrial hearings are not going to move into an actual trial phase. And I think people are beginning to be very concerned and thinking more about what would the outcome of a trial be. It would be years of appeal. So I do think there is the potential for a large section of family members being an important focus for really just abandoning the military commissions. I have to say, I am just so frustrated at the Biden administration's failure to transfer more of the men who have been cleared for release. That is just heartbreaking to me, that even when you get through all the sort of hypocrisy of the PRB process and get cleared for release, that you don't get out. And then finally, I think we need to address all of the long-term injustices that Guantanamo has presented us with. And that's another long discussion, but the difficulties of living as Mansoor has written about, and I'm really hoping he will write more about what it means to get out when you had to go through all that injustice, and then cope with building a new life. My heart just goes, I am so grateful for all that you're teaching us. So.
Thanks so much, Terry. Mansoor, I know you've thought about this deeply, not just personally, but also practically. Your thoughts on what are the most critical steps the Biden administration could be taking right now towards closing Guantanamo?
You know, he should listen to me. Simple as that. You know, last year when he was elected in January, we sent a letter called 8-point plan to close Guantanamo. That letter was sent by 6 former Guantanamo detainees, and we mentioned easily like 8 points that led to the closure of Guantanamo. And I graduated last year from my university. I wanted to do my thesis about the closure of Guantanamo, or the road to close Guantanamo. My faculty said, no, we didn't go that direction. So I changed my thesis into the rehabilitation and reintegration of former Guantanamo detainees into social life and the labor market. Basically, you know, closing Guantanamo is not that hard or difficult. It's lack of the will from the government. You know, President Biden can close it now, tomorrow. Just sign an executive order. People who has been cleared, like they should be transferred. The one who has been hasn't been cleared should be cleared. Those who should be put into trial and face the justice system. Anyone accused of crime, and they should be sentenced. And it is easy. It's logic. It's like space science. But as we see, what's happening at Guantanamo, as I said, it is also abusing to the American justice system. It is the justice denial to the victims of 9/11. You know, the government, who claim they fight, they are like trying to bring justice to the 9/11 families or victims. They actually abusing them by using that case. And 9/11 for the last 20 years has been misused and abused. So closing Guantanamo, I think if the government is willing to close it, they can close it in the next few months, 3 months maximum. So, but again, it's a prolonged game, and they want to give it there. We don't know for how long. People have hope that Biden will close it, but for me, sometime like we don't know exactly how they're going to deal with the case. As for life after Guantanamo, we still live in the shadow of Guantanamo. This is one of the problems. And, the government look at Guantanamo as a problem. It's not as a human being or as a case. It's just as a problem. It's not in their priorities. So when we transfer to hosting countries, it is funny. They bought us with money, and they pay for the hosting countries to take us. It's like the problem, they want to get rid of us. And based on my thesis and my research and communicating with around over 200 former Guantanamo prisoners, I'm working on my next book, Life After Guantanamo, which actually bring all the stories, how people live that life, people who actually managed to live or to integrate into the society, the others who actually still live in Guantanamo stigma. Some of the brothers end up in jail, being tortured and abused again. Some of them end up dying because the lack of providing either health care. Until now, I haven't met my family. Some of the brothers have been married for the last 7 years. They refuse to let their families or wives to come to visit them. So I addressed that in my letter to State Department about the recommendation and about life post Guantanamo. It just, as I say always, I demand that President Biden, close Guantanamo, and we actually also call on the people to endorse the 8-point plan to close Guantanamo, and the media pressure, because media helps a lot toward the pressure of closing Guantanamo. And also life after Guantanamo. It's just because as long as there is media pressure, also the lawyers who has been fighting for the last 20 years. And we hope that something is going to happen about the closure of Guantanamo. But now I hope for the next few months we can see more transfer. We hear some kind of news, there will be some kind of movement about transfer some prisoners to some countries. But actually, we haven't seen any tangible steps. They haven't appointed anyone who actually coordinate those transfer. Even sometimes when we try to find someone in State Department to contact them or talking about some issues through the lawyers, there is none so far. And yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. That's I think incredibly helpful and insightful set of steps. So we've got about 8 minutes, and there's some good questions in the chat that I'd like to turn to. I think one in particular that it would be terrific to hear from each of you on, and I think, you know, a subject that gets far too little attention and discussion in the public space, and that's what might accountability look like, both for past and ongoing harm, but also, Mansoor, for the post-release harms that I think you very well articulated. In any order folks want to take this in on the panel side, throw up a hand if you want to start, but I think it'd be great to hear from each of you on that. Terry.
You know, at this point, what I'm really hoping for is that we learn more of the truth about the events of 9/11, and that in exchange for the fact that, as Alka pointed out, the government never intended to conduct a fair trial, that there be accountability, meaningful accountability for the people who determined that it was proper and better to torture people than to believe in the rule of law. And, you know, I know that's a tall order, but I am not going to feel that my struggles have ended until there is accountability for torture.
Yeah, like as for us, as former Guantanamo detainees, accountability, it's actually justice. You know, when you talk about accountability is part of, it's like one of the justice parallel. So basically, I'd say for us, you know, acknowledgement to what happened to those former prisoners, apologizing, and compensation, because to help those prisoners to move on with their life. And most of us now, as we live in those countries as threat, being, you know, restricted, being, you know, arrested, interrogated, you know, some of us get beating, and struggling to make a life because the stigma of Guantanamo. And there isn't any kind of rehabilitation or reintegration program that can help those people to integrate into the society, to move on with their life. I mean, look into the basic, which is actually denied medical care, you know, no legal status, no access to education. So for me, in my case, I finished my education. It wasn't given, basically. I have to fight for it. I have to go on hunger strike twice. The first time 48 days, the second time 25 days. I was expelled from the universities. I was, you know, I don't want to tell my story, just wait to read it in my next book. But, you know, the fight hasn't over yet. And just the least, when I tried to find a job to work as driving kids, I was denied for driving license because the government said to my lawyer, we're afraid he's going to do some terrorist attack with the car. And I was with the meeting with my lawyer. When I look at them, I told my lawyer, I cannot stay with this meeting. I left, you know. So basically, in their view, our cases were handed to security service, to the police. And this is the way when you deal with these people, they look at you as a threat. They need to contain. Simple as that. They don't care about making life. They don't care about you being tortured or not. So for us, in order to, there's a gap in our life, 15 years. And I'm not going to say to be a normal person, because when I got to be a normal person, I have my own difficulties, challenges, mentally, psychologically, and so on. So you need to find a life, a community, a family that can try to push you a little from the 15 years. We faced another Guantanamo. I call it Guantanamo 2.0. You know, it's also in the shadow. And yeah, we still, like in my case, I'm still hoping that I will be able to move to other country where I can also try make a life for myself. And yeah, I mean, accountability is simply, it is acknowledgement, apologizing, compensation. And I wish there will be people who will held accountable, who tortured the prisoners, who misuse and abuse American justice system too. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, General Jeffrey Miller, and the CIA who torture people on the black sites. I mean, this is if American government would ready to close the Guantanamo chapter and close what they call war on terror, there must be some kind of acknowledgement and apologizing, compensation to that extent.
Alka, in addition, there's another question in the chat that if you're able to fold into this, great. If not, I know you're short on time, but the question about whether there are legal avenues for redress as part of the accountability question more broadly.
Well, I guess I should belatedly just say what I should have said at the beginning, which is that nothing I say ever represents the opinion of the Department of Defense. I think DOD knows by now, but I should probably just put it out there. In terms of legal avenues, I mean, the accountability question is so interesting, right? Because the fact that we, Terry mentioned we should hold people responsible. We should hold the torturers responsible. And of course, as a lawyer, right, I want people to be prosecuted for having committed war crimes and acts of torture. And successive administrations have said, no, we're not going to do that. And the problem with never enforcing our own rules on ourselves is that you start to see people who were involved in torture, publicly involved in torture, like Gina Haspel, like even like Avril Haines, right, who was involved in redacting the torture report, coming back, being promoted, right, being given really important jobs in subsequent administrations. And so when we tell ourselves, oh, the CIA program is over, it's never going to happen again, we don't know that. We've got the same people in charge over and over and over again with zero consequences. And so, I would love to see legal accountability for that. Unfortunately, I don't. In terms of legal recourse, the most that has ever happened, and the prosecution hates it when I say this, so I'm sorry, guys, I know you're listening, but I'm going to say it again. The closest we have ever gotten to actual accountability for the torture program is what is happening in the military commissions at Guantanamo, where we have spent 10 years just trying to pry loose more information, more transparency about the program, right? Through witness testimony, through, trying to get documents declassified and put it in the public realm, whatever we can that's unclassified, so that the public understands, look, this is what was done, right? This is how corrupted the entire system is. Because I think the American public has not just an obligation, but the right to know that this is how this has come about, and this is what's being done in our name. And this is, this is why things are taking so long. This is why we have not really fundamentally changed practices. And in fact, the lack of accountability is getting worse. And so I'd say in terms of, coming back to the original question, accountability, and I'll stop in like 30 seconds, I promise. I think there are sort of two ways two really actually simple ways to do it. The first is transparency, right? The first is transparency. The Senate torture report should be declassified and released tomorrow, right? There is zero reason to keep it classified other than embarrassment to the United States, which is not a legal basis for classification. Beyond that, right, there's so much more information even beyond just the torture report. There's a lot of information from witnesses. There's a lot of information from people at DOD, from people who are publicly acknowledged to be involved in not just CIA torture, but DOD torture at Guantanamo, abroad in Afghanistan, in Iraq, right? All of that information, there needs to be some sort of public reckoning around, right? And understanding by the public of that, so that we can put a pin in it and say, look, this is why it needs to not happen again, and this is how we're going to prevent it from happening again. And the second sort of part of it, which is slightly unrelated but equally important, I think, is what Mansoor mentioned about post-release, right? Just from a purely, I'll use the word mercenary, but from a purely like practical standpoint, it is in no one's national security interest to release men from Guantanamo after physically and psychologically damaging them with zero resources and zero, sort of framework to assist them and make reparation for what we did to them. It is just it's in no one's interest. From a human rights perspective, it's just illegal. We have a continuing obligation to these men. They deserve some sort of reparations, whether that's in the form of facilitating family reunification, whether that's in the form of paying for medical rehabilitation for the torture that they suffered, whether that's in the form of job training, right? Which is no more than what we provide for people who are released from prison here in the United States post-conviction. These men have not been convicted of anything. So, those are sort of the two big baskets that I would say need to happen, or a minimum for accountability.
Thank you so much, Alka, and thank you to Terry and Mansoor as well. We've reached the end of our time today, and it's unfortunate because I know that this discussion could continue for so much longer, and there's so much more I'd want to hear from all of you. But I think, each of you has painted such a vivid picture of the harms and the abuse associated with the prison at Guantanamo. And each of you has also offered compelling views and ideas and prescriptions for how the prison can be closed, and it can be done so effectively in a very short period of time if there were the political will to do so. So thank you for sharing those insights. Scott, thank you so much for your framing of our conversation and for so ably moderating amongst these very compelling panelists. I just want to remind everyone that we will continue our event series. Our next event will be focused on Afghanistan. Please look at your emails and at the CLS Human Rights Institute Twitter account for information on that. Today's recording will be available online. We'll share that with you from our Twitter account. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priyanka.
Thank you so much.